More than any other sport that I'm aware of, the NBA world is obsessed with comparing eras. Everything about today's game is constantly being held up against some version of the past, and people usually approach these comparisons in a way that really sucks. Either the greatness of a current player is downplayed due to nostalgia for a previous era that they couldn't have cut it in, or a past legend is put down because they played against plumbers. The same goes for the state of the sport as a whole. On one side of the spectrum, we had the "we done with the 90s" craze of younger fans declaring that the basketball of that era was garbage. And on the other side, we are constantly hearing from all over that basketball has in fact never been worse than it is in its current state. But all this talk, good and bad, about back in the day and remarkably even the present day game is rarely grounded in reality. These criticisms hardly ever seem to be reasonable claims forged by people actually watching the game closely. They're often nonsense, complete distortions of reality driven by false narratives and confirmation bias. So today, we're going to do what so many people won't. In a genuine effort to better appreciate, criticize, and above all else, understand basketball in all its stages, I watched an NBA game from every decade from the 1960s to today. And we're gonna analyze them all, comparing and contrasting trends, strategies, and skills as we witness the evolution of the game. To be consistent, I progressed through this history in 10-year intervals and watched an NBA Finals game from the middle of each decade, with the exception of this year because we haven't yet had the NBA Finals. It should go without saying that not every aspect of these eras is going to be perfectly represented in a single game between two teams. So I will be bringing up league-wide trends and characteristics of each era beyond just the individual games that we discuss closely. But these games will be our starting point for exploring each decade in NBA history. So let's start from the beginning. Not literally back in 1946 when the NBA, then the BAA, was founded, but in the first iconic NBA era, the 1960s, which also happens to be when we actually start to have semi-consistent footage of full games. That being said, I couldn't find a full broadcast of the final game of the 1965 NBA Finals between the Celtics and Lakers, so we're just gonna scoot a couple years back and watch Game 6 of the 1963 Finals between the Celtics and Lakers. There were only 9 teams in the NBA in 1963, and throughout the decade, these two consistently stood above the rest. Just how often did the Celtics and Lakers face off in the finals? Well, only 7 times between 1959 and 1969. Did the Lakers win a single one of those meetings? No, they did not. But in this game, as they often did, they got mighty close, largely on the back of their 2 superstars, Elgin Baylor and Jerry West, who stand out as the most exciting offensive players to watch in this game. Baylor was ahead of his time as an athlete, with his famed hang time and impressive explosiveness. This is an in-and-out dribble and some lightning quick change in direction. That's pretty nasty for 1963, especially when you consider how strictly the league called carries. Your palm had to be fully over the ball at all times, so most modern dribble moves would be considered illegal. West was an all-around guard, very effective at getting downhill, but also a highly skilled jump shooter. You'll notice that a number of his self-created buckets, either drives or jump shots off the dribble, involve him turning his back to the basket at some point, which was very common at the time, given the stricter ball handling rules, the more limited ball handling skill, and the use of hand checking. West was also an excellent defensive guard with a 6'9" wingspan and would grow into an elite playmaker. So those two have the most modern-looking games on the court. But opposite them, a star like Bob Cousy, who was in his final season, had a much more unorthodox style by today's standards, with a predominantly one-handed set shot and an array of slow, one-footed runners. His bag was weird. They called him the Houdini of the hardwood for his unique craftiness at the time, and he was undoubtedly the greatest passer of the 50s, but some of his trickiness is a bit unserious. Like, who is this pass fake fooling? But Cousy was not the only one with a very strange shot. The NBA was still in its nascent stage, and shooting mechanics were far from ironed out league wide. As another reflection of the novelty of the game, you do see a very large gap between the skill level of the best players and the worst players on the floor at this time. In terms of the style of the era, basketball was played at an obscenely fast pace in 1963. The typical team averaged almost 120 possessions per 48 minutes, which dwarfs the present day average of about 99 possessions. So, much of the game was decided in transition. Outlet passes were all the rage at this time, and Bill Russell was renowned for his ability to start the fast break as a big man for the Celtics, who played at the fastest pace in this sped up era. When teams did play in the half court, offensive sets were rather simple. Handoffs were very popular at this time, especially in an offense like Boston's because they had such a good playmaking big in Russell. Generally, these handoffs were intended to free up a jump shooter, but you see some of the variations off of that threat that are still run today. If you chase the guard over top, he can just run through and turn this into a cut, or you can fake the handoff and attack off the dribble yourself in a keep action. At this time, pick and roll was used sparingly. Oscar Robertson was the best at it over in Cincinnati, but here you see a handoff flow into a pick and roll, which has actually become quite a common action in today's game. A real two-man game like that out of pick and roll was rare though. Screens were primarily used to free up jump shooters with the expectation the defender would go under, but occasionally a defense might switch the pick and roll to negate that space. But a number of possessions basically boil down to a player just kind of trying to shoot over top of the defense, at times almost randomly, and defenses were generally willing to play off and concede these jumpers because everything was worth 2 points. And if everything counts the same, the defense would rather you take a bunch of 18-footers than get a bunch of looks at the rim, which meant that interior defense and the role of the center was most important in this era. Nobody better exemplifies that than Bill Russell. Blocks weren't officially tracked yet, but by my count, he swatted 8 shots in this game, which was typical throughout his 13-year career, in which he anchored 12 number 1 defenses. And Russell was not some big lug, by the way. He was very agile at 6'9" and made several blocks in this game in space, but protecting the rim and anchoring the glass was exceptionally crucial at this time, which he did by gobbling up 24 boards in this game, right on his season average. This is why I consider Russell the clear defensive GOAT, because the impact that one dominant rim protector could have at this time is completely unparalleled in the modern game. The extreme importance of being able to get shots in the paint on one end and prevent them on the other that existed before the three-point era made this the age of bigs. 3 of the NBA's top 5 scorers in 1963 were bigs: Bob Pettit, Walt Bellamy, and of course, Wilt Chamberlain, who also equaled Russell's rebounding and block totals. One other little funny way that your big could have an impact at this time: every quarter was started with a jump ball up until 1975, so your center could win you an extra possession or two like that. But while bigs were thriving, given the spacing and skill constraints of the time, offenses were quite inefficient, with a league average offensive rating of 95.9. It is worth noting that although defenses were absolutely right to prioritize taking away the rim, teams could make jump shots. Obviously not at today's level, but the league average field goal percentage in 1963 was 44, and the league average free throw percentage was 73, just 5 points lower than it is in 2025. If we're looking at free throw numbers though, what's really crazy is that teams attempted 14 more free throws per game in 1963 than they do today, which will happen when everybody's trying to get in the paint. So, to summarize some of the key characteristics of mid-1960s basketball, bigs ruled the world on both ends. Pace was crazy fast. Offenses were relatively simple and inefficient, with only shades of more modern actions, and the skill disparity between stars and role players was quite large. Let's move on now to the 1970s, which were the opposite of the previous decade in one major way. While the 60s were dominated by the greatest dynasty in NBA history, the 70s were defined by parity. The league saw 9 different champions in 10 years, and the latter half of the decade especially featured a number of frankly subpar finals matchups and champions, including the 1975 finals between the 48-win Golden State Warriors and the Washington Bullets. The NBA's talent pool was also significantly diluted by the existence of the ABA, which it would merge with in the 1976-77 season. But in 1975, a number of the best players in the world, like Julius Erving, George Gervin, George McGinnis, Artis Gilmore, Dan Issel, young Moses Malone, are all in another league entirely. So this was a very unusual time for the NBA, and Game 4 of the 1975 Finals, in which the Warriors finished off a surprising sweep, was an appropriately strange game for this weird little pocket in basketball history. To set the weird tone, the Warriors' legendary head coach Al Attles got thrown out of this game very early on, which is fitting because the NBA had a bit of a fighting problem in the late 70s. But in terms of the basketball itself, the 70s had plenty of similarities to the 60s. The pace was not quite as frantic, but it was still a good bit faster than anything we've seen since, as the league averaged a 104.5 pace in 1975. Half-court offense was more efficient than it had been in the 60s, but still relatively inefficient. So the premium on getting out in transition remained, and if any aspect of the sport peaked at this time, it was outlet passing. My goodness, there are so many sick outlet passes in this game. Of course, Wes Unseld is considered by many to be the GOAT outlet passer, but look at his fellow big Elvin Hayes delivering a dime here. And this was a beauty by Hayes that should have led to a go-ahead layup with 1 minute left in an NBA Finals elimination game. But instead, Dick Gibbs, who had played 17 total minutes in the entire postseason, is for some reason in the game at this pivotal moment, and as the recipient of this pass, he smokes a wide open layup. This is the sort of weirdness that could only happen in this more primitive version of the NBA. A modern defense probably wouldn't fall asleep in transition in such a massive moment to allow that wide open layup. A guy like Gibbs would never be on the floor for a moment that big, and it's a hell of a lot less likely he'd miss the layup. Can you imagine if that entire confluence of events went down in an NBA Finals game with today's media landscape? It would be immortalized. J.R. Smith's blunder in 2018 would take a historical backseat to Gibbs's blown layup. I will say, there is some magic in a moment like this. It sort of feels like present-day March Madness, where mayhem is always possible. A kid could miss both free throws in a huge spot, or dribble the ball off his own foot against the press, or make any sort of catastrophic mistake that NBA players in 2025 are just too good to make. I do see the value of the drama that creates and the humanity of players being so imperfect. And just as one final little cherry on top, Gibbs later said the reason he missed the layup was because he had eaten a weed brownie. Unfortunately, as funny as that is, Gibbs did legitimately grapple with addiction, and that is reflective of the fact that in the late 70s, the NBA had a pretty big drug problem. The league had plenty of issues, and it was not popular, so this was an incredibly strange time for the NBA, but we haven't even gotten to the most peculiar part of this game, the turnovers. The Bullets and Blazers combined for 60 turnovers in Game 4. That's the second most ever in a finals matchup, topped only by the 63 turnovers they combined for in the previous game. Since 1978, no team has ever had 27 turnovers in a single finals game, And both the Blazers and Bullets did it against each other in back-to-back games in 1975. A number of these turnovers are mostly a product of trying to push pace aggressively in an up-tempo era, but some of these sequences are just unbelievably sloppy and careless. And even down to the final minute of the game, there are some beyond head-scratching turnovers. Like with 30 seconds left, down one, Wes Unseld just drops the ball off the inbound. The Bullets did not want to win this game with how they played down the stretch. It's also worth noting that a number of violations were called more tightly at this time. There were a handful of moving screens called in this game and a handful of charges. And overall, a lot more fouls were called 50 years ago compared to present day, over 20% more per possession. But the turnovers were a big problem in this game, and although this was an extreme example, this was indicative of a league-wide reality. Teams turned it over a lot in 1975, about 30% more per possession than in the present day. So just speaking frankly, this made for a pretty ugly Game 4 of the 1975 finals. But there were some great moments. Rick Barry was one of the first great playmaking forwards, an extremely valuable archetype that has really blossomed in the 21st century. He runs a beautiful pick and roll here and delivers this jumping underhanded dime, and the man loved a jump pass. The pick and roll game was a tick more developed by this stage, though still scarcely used, but here you see Hayes make a nice play off the short roll, and I did enjoy seeing this very early example of a defense icing a screen, forcing the ball handler to the baseline and away from the pick for the Bullets to then counter the drop coverage with the big popping. Those are just a couple of basic little glimpses into the future of pick and roll. It's also worth noting that although we don't think of Unseld as a scorer, both he and Hayes were solid jump shooters as Washington's two starting bigs. And the shot making in this game was actually pretty good. The teams combined to shoot about 48% from the field, they just couldn't stop giving the ball away. There were also a few nice off-ball actions in this game, a couple of beautiful quick-hitting passes to cutters from the Warriors, and here, the Bullets bigs set an elevator screen to free up the shooter off-ball, but similarly to the 60s game, there was not a ton of successful, cleanly executed, organized offense in the half court. Again, you see a lot of dudes kind of aimlessly chucking contested jumpers, all still two-pointers at this point. Tons of offense still ran through the post in this era, where teams were very comfortable doubling because of the poor spacing. Also, there were lots of offensive rebounds, about 20% more per possession than today, given that basically every team was starting two real bigs who mostly lived in the paint. And this was still an age of bigs, not as iconic as the 60s, but every single MVP in the 70s was a big man. Kareem, Bob McAdoo, Dave Cowens, Bob Lanier, Hayes. These were largely the players who ran the league in 1975 because of the extreme value on protecting the paint defensively and scoring in the paint offensively. That's what bigs did. So, to summarize, the 70s was the weirdest decade for the NBA. Everybody was fighting, lots of people were doing drugs, there were no great defining teams of the era, everybody played fast, they turned it over a lot, still had pretty simple strategy on both sides of the ball, and the world was run by bigs. But, bit by bit, the game was evolving. Now let's jump to 1985. The NBA has been saved by the revival of its two greatest brands, the Celtics and the Lakers, and their captivating megastars, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. Those two engineered the NBA's top two offenses in 1985, but as a whole, the mid to late 80s was a time of offensive prosperity. Pace was slower than it had been in the 1970s, but still higher than any time we've seen since. So the game was still played fast, and offenses were significantly more efficient than they had been a decade prior. And suddenly, for the first time ever, the two faces of the league were not bigs. Over the previous 25 years, 23 MVPs had been awarded to big men. But from 1984 to 1992, 9 straight MVPs would go to Bird, Magic, or Jordan. Bird and Magic were both 6'9", boasting the sort of size that could have made them conventional power forwards, but both of their skill sets transcended those old-fashioned ideas of position. Both players, especially Bird, could rebound like bigs, but they were also the two best passers in the sport. Larry was also the best shooter in the game, and Magic was an actual point guard, which had never been seen from a player of that size. Both could fill numerous offensive roles. Bird could curl around screens and shoot, he could nail pull-up jumpers, he was extremely crafty scoring out of the low post, and was an excellent difficult shot maker with a beautiful fadeaway. Plus, he had great instincts as a cutter and was a strong offensive rebounder, and his instinctive, creative passing with his tremendous court mapping and feel was the most fun aspect of his game to watch. Magic, meanwhile, was perhaps the greatest transition player we've ever seen, engineering the Lakers' patented up-tempo Showtime offense, while he delivered passes with unprecedented audacity and ingenuity and was an underrated, uber-efficient scorer. Those two are a joy to watch, as are some of their star teammates. James Worthy put on a nice mid-range performance, 38-year-old Kareem was still working his sky hook, the most unstoppable move in NBA history. Kevin McHale showed off his impressive array of post moves as one of the craftiest we've ever seen down there, and Robert Parrish also had some nice moments in the post. The high-end talent on the court in this game pops a hell of a lot more than it did in the '75 finals. And if you couldn't tell, post play was the strongest aspect not just of this game, but of this era. And the Stars delivered a lot of good moments there. But it is worth noting that a vast majority of possessions in this game ran through the post, which could get quite repetitive. There were a lot of possessions where the player posts up, draws a double, kicks out, then reposts, and defenses could often double from one pass away, basically with impunity, because the player they were leaving, even including a star guard like Dennis Johnson, was not a comfortable outside shooter. Even if the double team led to a kick-out pass to an open shooter for a 17-footer, defenses would live with that. In fact, it was pretty common for a player to be so determined to deny the post entirely that he would just concede a wide-open jumper to a guard to keep the post player from ever touching the ball. And if anyone tries to tell you these jumpers are more interesting to watch than an open three-pointer created by a drive and kick, well, they're delusional and blindly nostalgic. Also, Dennis Johnson and Danny Ainge, both good players, combined to go 6 of 31 in this game, so the Lakers defense was absolutely correct to dare them to make jump shots. If the post player did get the rock, they were overwhelmingly dealing with rough spacing. Sometimes they'd have to try to beat the double team themselves or navigate these super crowded paints, and naturally this led to some poor shots and turnovers. And there were still a lot of turnovers in this era, about 20% more per possession than today. So the stars of this era are awesome, but they are in some ways limited by the shortcomings of those around them and the lack of versatility of players at this time. It's easier to guard a team when you know multiple guys want to be posting up every possession, and you'll gladly double a star posting up to concede jumpers to a number of other players because they aren't very efficient shots. Remember, the three-point line existed in 1985, but was hardly used. Teams attempted only 3 triples per game and shot just 28%. Outside shooting was quite limited, and certain guards, like Dennis Johnson, were still very prone to turning their backs to the basket often. So in 1985, the game is prettier than before, and the talent is better, and the stars are super interesting, but offenses still had some real limitations. In terms of designed offense, there were some nice off-ball actions in this game. Another elevator screen to free up a shooter here, and the Celtics offense made really effective use of some motion concepts with off-ball screening and movement to stress the defense. For example, Bird screens for Scott Wedman here, who draws 2 as he tries to spring free for a jumper, which leaves Bird wide open, and Boston's famed ball movement and collective passing in these spots really is pretty. These sort of off-ball actions were relatively common in 80s basketball, but I do want to note that stylistic versatility was blossoming at this time. The Celtics and Lakers both had very unique aspects to their offenses, and innovation was taking place around the league. Under head coach Doug Moe, the Denver Nuggets played at a breakneck pace, excelled at winning the turnover battle, and emphasized quick decisions in an offensive system predicated on ball and player movement. Don Nelson was introducing some small ball lineups with the very successful Milwaukee Bucks, which would be a defining aspect of his coaching philosophy throughout his career as the father of small ball. So in many ways, the game was growing in terms of talent, popularity, strategy, variety, and offense had improved a lot compared to a decade prior. But of course, change is gradual. A typical NBA game was still played fast, turnovers and offensive rebounds remained high, most offense ran through the post in the half court with two true bigs starting for both teams, so spacing was generally pretty poor, and there was more pick and roll, but still not much. I also feel like I have to address the narrative that defense used to be so much better, which people often say in reference to the 80s through the 2000s. It's just not true. The job of a defense was much simpler. They had to cover much less space and deal with fewer freak athletes, highly skilled shooters, and ball handlers. You could ignore a lot of offensive players on the perimeter. There was a lot less ball pressure than we see today, and the difference in physicality is overstated. The game was played more through the post, which is and always has been the most physical part of basketball. There was a bit more hand checking, and there were more hard fouls and fights, sure, although there were none of either in this game. But some people want you to believe every game was a Bad Boy Pistons Dirty Plays compilation. And if you sit down and watch full games from this time, you'll see the difference in physicality in the average game is not as drastic as you've probably been led to believe. Also, about 29% more fouls were getting called per possession. So teams weren't just getting away with a ton of fouling, which is a good thing because that would bog down offense. And the offensive boom of the 80s was a big part of what made the game great at the time. Overall, this was a good era of hoops that was crucial in boosting the popularity of the NBA and helping the league grow into what it's become. Now we're on to 1995, so ironically, we will be watching an NBA Finals game from the 90s that doesn't include Michael Jordan. But I actually think in a lot of ways, this matchup between the Houston Rockets and the Orlando Magic better captures the essence of this decade because this was an age of bigs. There has never been an era more loaded with elite center talent than the 90s. In fact, 4 of the top 5 MVP vote getters this year were centers: David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, and of course, Shaquille O'Neal and Hakeem Olajuwon, who faced off in the finals. The other player to finish top 5 in MVP voting was also a big, Karl Malone, not to mention other dominant forces like Alonzo Mourning and Dikembe Mutombo. The 1995 season also sits at sort of a historical intersection, somewhere in between the up-tempo, offensive-oriented game of the late 80s and the slow slugfests that are to follow in the late 90s and early 2000s, although pace had already slowed down considerably by 95. But as this was an age of bigs, a whole lot of possessions ran through the post. A lot of those touches went to Shaq and Hakeem in an awesome battle between two totally unique post-up legends. Shaq with his unrivaled power and underrated agility and touch versus Hakeem's unparalleled grace, footwork, and difficult shot making. Although I do have to point out this disgusting foul grift by Hakeem, pump faking to get the defender in the air, then jumping into the foul. That's just not basketball. I'm just kidding around. There's definitely a lot more foul baiting in today's game than in the past, but it did happen. But posting up was certainly not limited to the elite bigs. In fact, Dennis Scott, a wing who was probably the best three-point shooter in the league at the time, posted up 4 times in this game. Down the stretch though, essentially every single possession was a Shaq or Hakeem post up. So again, there was a fair bit of repetitiveness. There was still lots of doubling the post, which was very appropriate given who these teams were dealing with, and both Hakeem and Shaq made several nice passes out of doubles. There were still lots of 2-point spot-up jumpers being attempted off kick-out passes from said post-ups, but we also saw an increased use of the 3-point line at this time, certainly in part due to the fact that the line was shortened from 1995 to 1997 to incentivize players to use it more. In fact, 3-point attempts went up by over 50% when the rule was changed to about 15 per game, but when they returned to the normal three-point distance in the 1998 season, attempts instantly dropped to undo about half of that bump. Nevertheless, this game featured two of the best three-point shooting teams in the league who were using the three ball a lot and doing so successfully, knocking down 25 of 58 combined attempts in this game. That was an unusually high number for the time, but this matchup featured perimeter sharpshooters like Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson for Orlando, and one of the early stretch fours in Robert Horry for Houston, an archetype that was beginning to pop up around the league with other players like Terry Mills and Sam Perkins. Pull-up threes, however, were still quite rare, and the game was mostly played from the paint, which meant rim protection was extremely important, and this was perhaps the greatest era of shot blockers the league has ever seen, with Akeem, Dikembe, Zoe, Ewing, and Robinson roaming the paint among others. Pick and roll was also slowly increasing in popularity, most notably with John Stockton and Karl Malone on the Utah Jazz, who really embraced the action, but it was still used sparingly in this game and in somewhat peculiar ways at times, like this Clyde Drexler post-up turns into a very low pick and roll. And Clyde was one of a couple of unique talents in this game besides Shaq and Akeem. There was Penny Hardaway, the most prominent jumbo point guard since Magic Johnson, a 6'7" super athlete, and Drexler, the 6'7" high-flying shooting guard who could rebound, playmake, cut, and push in transition at a very high level, but who was not a particularly good outside shooter or ball handler. Clyde's success speaks to one thing I really enjoy about this era, which is that certain unorthodox stars like Drexler or the 6'6", 252-pound playmaking power forward Charles Barkley were able to thrive with their totally unique cocktails of skill sets, and they weren't held back by certain limitations of theirs that would almost certainly prevent them from ever reaching such stardom in today's game. Nobody looks like those guys today, and nobody even looked like them then, but they were super cool talents. But while we're commending the state of the league in 1995, I do have to ask again, was defense really better as people insist? Still, no. Again, defensive objectives were much simpler. Double the post, live with jump shooters taking some open shots, not much pick and roll to worry about, less space to cover, and just check out these defensive efforts, all from one team, pulled from just one 5-minute stretch of game time with your season on the line in the NBA Finals. That's not the sort of psycho killer rip your balls out and eat 'em effort that some would lead you to believe was omnipresent in the 90s. Also, if you didn't know, zone defense was illegal throughout all NBA history until the 2002 season, which is just kind of a bummer because it caps defensive creativity and obviously favored offenses. So, the NBA in 1995 is still largely a big man's post-up league, but things are starting to change. The three-point shot is finally being used. The stretch four is being born, although most teams still start two conventional bigs, but the best offenses in the league did have some variety. There were a number of very post-centric units, but the Suns played with a ton of pace and put up nearly 20 threes per game, a lot at the time under Paul Westphal. The Jazz ran Jerry Sloan's flex offense with lots of off-ball screening and cutting, and a heavy dose of pick and roll, and the Bulls, of course, ran the triangle offense, designed to optimize spacing at the time and maximize your options to take whatever the defense gives you. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, Pat Riley's Knicks won without even producing good offense, playing at a slow pace and thriving on the back of mean, historic, physical defenses, foreshadowing what the next mini era of basketball would look like. And while offenses were relatively efficient, pace was slowing down, a trend that would continue into the dead ball era. Now it's 2005, and the NBA has a big problem. The last 6 seasons have been the 6th worst by offensive efficiency since the 1970s, and the pace in 2005 was the 7th slowest in NBA history, and the only 6 slower seasons all came between 1997 and 2006. We tend to expect offense to just trend up in sports over time, but the exact opposite happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, and everything reached an absolute low point in terms of pace and offensive efficiency in the 2004 season. The game was too physical, too slow. Offense was grueling to watch, so the league decided to make a change, outlawing hand checking for the 2005 season in an effort to increase freedom of movement and boost offensive efficiency, which it did. League average offensive rating took a bit of a jump in 2005 and then actually plateaued for the next decade. I've mentioned it a couple times already, but for those who don't know, a hand check is when a defender has his hand placed on the hip of an offensive player out on the perimeter. It's a way to feel the offensive player's change of direction and basically impose yourself on them more physically. So you ban it and offenses become a bit more efficient. That makes sense, but I do think it's important to note that hand checking had actually been illegal since 1979. And then in 1994, the league announced that they would be enforcing that rule more strictly. And then they re-emphasized that point in 2004. So hand checking had actually already been illegal for 25 years at that point. It was always just a question of how tightly it was called. On paper, hand checking has been outlawed for almost 50 years, but it's never actually been fully eliminated from the game. And if you watch games today, you will see that there is still hand checking. It's a myth that it was vanquished in 2004. But the NBA did decide to tighten things up at that point. Still, offense was in a very bad place overall, and perhaps no game could have better captured the distinct characteristics of this era of basketball than Game 7 of the 2005 Finals between the Detroit Pistons and the San Antonio Spurs. These were two dominant defenses, but the Spurs were just the 8th rated offense that season, while the Pistons were the number 17 offense. It's exceedingly rare that a team that offensively limited makes the finals, but Detroit had actually just won the title the year prior with an offense that was just as mediocre. And as you can see, given that offense was down league-wide, this was the time to make a run with a shitty offense and great defense, especially in the weak Eastern Conference. So, with these two unremarkable offenses facing off in an era of abhorrent offense league-wide, it is very appropriate that this game finished with a final score of 81-74 that frankly oversells the offensive production in this game because it was 73-68 with a minute remaining before the intentional fouling game got started. The pace was agonizingly slow. This was known as the dead ball era and the iso ball era because it was defined by lots of long, stagnant possessions where a star just stares down the defense and then puts up a pretty tough shot. And in this game, Tim Duncan was the one doing that the most, with lots of drawn-out face-ups that are not the prettiest to watch. But offense certainly got much worse than Duncan isos and post-ups, like these several Ben Wallace post-ups. Keep in mind, Wallace averaged 0.62 points per post-up that season and shot just over 30% on post-ups. Or you could be treated to a Nazi Muhammad post-up, who also averaged 0.62 points per post-up. That is truly horrific offense. To put it into perspective, an Andre Robertson three-pointer was worth 0.76 points per possession in his career, somehow significantly better than a Wallace or Muhammad post-up, but it was common practice at this time to just dedicate several possessions per game to really bad post players posting up. And although Rasheed Wallace was a good jump shooter who did take some threes, both teams were essentially still starting two true bigs. The Spurs were starting two centers. So it was routine for either squad to have two bigs just posted up on opposite blocks. So obviously, spacing was still rough. And on average, teams were not utilizing the three-point line any more in 2005 than they were in 1995. It's remarkable to think about the skill set of a player like Rip Hamilton, who spends all game running around off ball and curling around screens like a madman, and how much more valuable and efficient he could have been if, instead of living off a bunch of long twos, he could just extend those same shots out a few feet further beyond the arc. But he didn't. He was still a multiple-time All-Star, but scored with below league average efficiency in his career because of his reliance on those long twos that could have been threes. So he was limited by the strategy of his era in that way. Also, given the snail-like pace of this era, offenses took a long time to get into their actions, and especially in a game like this between two excellent defensive teams, if that action didn't progress as they hoped, the possession would just devolve into somebody jacking up a tough shot to beat the shot clock. So there's not much good to say about the offense in this game or this series, but Manu Ginobili was like a ray of sunshine in this dark, moldy basement of an offensive matchup, with his driving, shooting, playmaking, and efficiency, and his ability to run effective pick-and-roll offense, which, for the first time in any of the games we've watched in this series, we see emerge as an actual bread-and-butter action for a team. The Spurs were not the highest volume pick-and-roll offense in 2005. That was the Suns, who were at the cutting edge of offense in basically every way, but they were 7th in pick-and-roll frequency and were an important part of the emerging pick-and-roll revolution. Both Manu and Tony Parker were legitimate high-level pick-and-roll operators, and the Spurs turned specifically to Manu running pick-and-roll a good bit down the stretch, and he made some great plays, splitting two defenders up at the level here and beating a blitz here by finding big shot Bob Horry. But often, the Pistons defense still won the battle against the Spurs pick-and-roll attack. Here, Parker sees drop coverage with Ben Wallace parked inside as a deterrent, and he doesn't want to take a pull-up jumper, and Duncan isn't a threat to punish the drop as a popper, so the play is neutralized. Here, Detroit blitzes Brent Barry running pick-and-roll, who successfully finds an open Parker, but he's not comfortable shooting an open catch-and-shoot three, so the advantage is gone. Then Parker tries to run a pick-and-roll of his own, but because he's not a threat to shoot the wide-open three, his defender just goes right under Muhammad's screen. So now Parker is scrambling, and he runs another pick-and-roll. This time, the defender shows, but Parker shoots by him with his superior quickness and appears to make a play with the shot clock winding down, until Muhammad fumbles this catch because, well, you're starting Nazi Muhammad alongside another center, by the way, in the NBA Finals. What do you expect? So the defense in this series was definitely great, but the offensive limitations of both teams also made the defense's job significantly easier. Like, if you don't have to worry about even a star guard like Parker shooting wide open threes off the catch or pulling up, and the bigs are seriously unskilled, your task is just so much simpler because the offense can hurt you in far fewer ways. That being said, the defensive effort in this game was awesome. Look at Bruce Bowen here flying around two separate screens off ball to follow Chauncey Billups all the way across the court and block this shot. I thought the screen navigation from guards on both sides was excellent all game, while both teams had a historic rim protector for backline defense. So, defense was king, rim protection was still king, and offenses were in the gutter. But there was one major exception to that in 2005. The Phoenix Suns, who were lighting up the world with their truly revolutionary 7 seconds or less offense as they played at the fastest pace in the league, ran the most pick and roll in the league, and shot the most threes in the league, en route to posting one of the best relative offenses in league history, all led by the best passer and shooter in the league, Steve Nash. They were the light on the horizon for NBA offense. Also underratedly pioneering offense were the 2005 Supersonics, the league's number 2 unit, who were second in pick and roll and three-point volume and had not just Ray Allen, but 2 6'10" guys attempting at least 5 threes per game and making them at an elite clip. But overall, three-point volume was no higher league-wide than a decade prior, and teams were running more pick and roll, but this was still an ISO and post-up heavy league where offenses were slow and not doing well. I do have to say, this was the glory age of the power forward, with guys like Duncan, Dirk Nowitzki, and Kevin Garnett, all indisputable top 5 players with very distinct skill sets. But overall, was the product in a good place in terms of watchability? Just being honest, no. And God knows I hate ratings discourse. I just don't care about them. They have nothing to do with my enjoyment of the sport. But since everybody's wanted to talk about ratings all year this year, I will point out that the 03, 05, and 07 finals, all featuring the Spurs, were the 3 least watched between 1982, when the NBA Finals got off tape delay, and the pandemic. I enjoy an occasional rock fight in the playoffs. They can build tension, and every bucket can feel bigger when they're harder to come by. But it's not something I want to see consistently. It shouldn't be the norm. People can romanticize an 81-74 game all they want, and I've seen people do it. But if you watch a game like that all the way through, you realize it's not just great defense keeping the score low. It's a healthy combination of great defense, excruciatingly slow pace, and bad offense. That was basically the NBA in the late 90s and early 2000s. Let's go now to 2015. Everything is suddenly changing really fast. And honestly, this is just the start of it. But there's a little baby-faced assassin, goes by the name Steph Curry, who just won league MVP and set the all-time single-season record for three-pointers made with 286. A number that, a decade later, by the way, Malik Beasley has already surpassed. But in 2015, the greatest shooting backcourt in NBA history was emerging with Curry and Klay Thompson. The Warriors ran a one-of-a-kind offense, using some classic motion principles with lots of off-ball screening and cutting, running lots of split actions. But everything is different when you have two guys putting up over 15 combined threes per game who can make 44% of them, who are extremely efficient from deep, even off movement, even when contested. And the impact of that shooting is so much greater than the box score even indicates, because what happens when you, as a defense, have to worry about that every possession? Well, you overplay the threat of Steph curling over top for a three, and he beats you with a back cut out of this split action. Or here, the threat of Steph shooting initially draws two to the ball as he runs pick and roll, and although Dellavedova peels off late, he's sort of scrambling to deal with this down screen that Draymond is setting for Klay, and since things are a bit disorganized, and he and Shumpert are both terrified of Klay getting free for a three, Draymond just slips to the rim unnoticed for a wide open dunk. Everybody is sucked in by Steph and Klay's gravitational pull out beyond the three-point line, which means their shooting led the Warriors to manufacture wide-open layups at an unparalleled rate. And the combination of shooting skill, player, and ball movement they had resulted in probably the prettiest offense of all time. By the way, pick and roll had exploded league-wide by 2015. The league average frequency had doubled since 2005, but the Warriors, favoring motion, were actually 28th in the league in pick and roll frequency. Still, the Dubs were doing novel things there too. Because Steph's range was unprecedented, they started setting screens higher than we'd ever seen. This is set about 35 feet out, and Thompson is playing a high drop coverage, so Steph can't just walk into a pull-up three, but that leaves the pick and pop big, the legend Mo Spates, wide open. Those high screens often pulled two defenders out high to the ball, which means if Steph just gets a pocket pass off to Draymond, the offense has a 4-on-3. And this is where the uniqueness of Draymond's skill set gets to shine. He is an excellent decision maker who can make these reads off the short roll to spot shooters or throw lobs. That short roll playmaking skill set was very rarely encountered or utilized in the NBA before Draymond, but now it's one of the most valuable connective traits we look for in a big. So Dre can screen for you, but he can also handle. Now he's running inverted pick and roll with Steph screening for him. And because Steph is such a shooting threat, Shumpert has to stay glued to him, which leaves Thompson, a big man, trying to get around a screen and trailing the play. And although Dre misses the initial layup, they eventually capitalize on their numbers advantage for a bucket. By the way, Steph is one of the most willing screening guards ever. He sets this back screen for Festus Ezeli, and they just cannot leave Steph, so the big gets a free dunk. This is just another way to weaponize Steph's gravity. Now, when we talk about the Warriors offense, I do have to mention that the moving screens are not being called quite as tightly as they were back in 1975, which does give an advantage to offenses. But regardless, the NBA had never seen offense like this. And with Steph, the stress on the defense never stops. Here, he forces the switch, gets downhill, passes out to Draymond, and then, as the slower Thompson relaxes for 1 second, relocates for an open three. Steph has always been one of a kind as a shooter and, crucially, as an off-ball mover. And the Warriors' whole motion offense has remained unique in the decades since, but his range and three-point volume laid a blueprint for guards around the league to force defenses to guard more space. But a couple of other elite guards, Damian Lillard and James Harden, were already shooting the three ball with comparable volume to Steph, and the whole league was getting smarter and better about threes. In fact, the Warriors didn't lead the league in three-point attempts, they were fourth. Three-point volume was up nearly 40% league-wide compared to a decade prior, and that increase would only accelerate in the following years. And look at this, Harrison Barnes consciously takes a step back to make this a three instead of a long two. Still, there was a lot of change yet to occur on that front. Mid-range volume in 2015 still looked more similar to that of 20 years ago than of today. In fact, only one team had already really trimmed down on their mid-range frequency, and that was the Houston Rockets, led by James Harden and Daryl Morey. But the Warriors were a leader in this revolution, and this particular game also doesn't even capture another one of the Dubs' major innovations, their ability to play true small ball with their famous death lineup with Draymond Green at center, where their five-out offense was unstoppable and they thrived defensively thanks to their switchability and speed with multiple big athletic wings and Draymond's elite backline defense. Small ball had existed previously with a number of Don Nelson teams, as we discussed earlier, in the mid-2000s Suns, but the Warriors made it a more mainstream strategy. With their sleek, new age personnel, the Warriors also played at the fastest pace in the league, working to speed up a game that was still relatively slow. On the flip side, the Cavs did not look quite so futuristic. To be fair, Kevin Love was out for this series, so this wasn't their ideal starting lineup, but they did start both Tristan Thompson and Timofey Mozgov together, and Thompson, very clearly a center by today's standards, had been mostly considered a power forward up to that point. Remember, this was only the beginning of the league's recent metamorphosis, and specifically, the power forward position was at a crossroads between the burgeoning, more perimeter-skilled stretch fours and the more classic, lumbering, back-to-the-basket power forwards. In a couple years, this would spark a whole discourse about the death of the power forward position, which did not die, but instead evolved in a really cool way, which we'll get back to later. But in spite of their old-fashioned front court in this game, the Cavs did usually have a stretch big in Love, and they actually attempted more threes per game than the Warriors in the regular season. LeBron, probably the best kick-out passer ever, loved having that shooting around him, and the drive and kick game was becoming more prominent and valuable because it was creating more threes compared to long twos. But the more distinct innovation that you see from LeBron in this game is the art of mismatch hunting. In all the previous games we watched, there were a lot fewer ball screens. Teams also switched some of those screens, but less so than, say, the 2015 Warriors, which was a team with several versatile defenders like Draymond Green, Andre Iguodala, Klay Thompson, and Harrison Barnes, who you can expect to guard a variety of players well. Switching also becomes more prominent when the players screening are not bigs, who a conventional pick and roll coverage like drop is designed with in mind as the screener. So for example, if LeBron screens for Kyrie, the Warriors will switch Klay onto LeBron because they think Klay at 6'7" should still be able to guard LeBron reasonably well, and they don't want to deal with the advantages that arise if they briefly put two defenders on the ball, like when Iggy shows here and is then trailing LeBron, who successfully attacks a 4-on-3. So they switch Klay onto LeBron, but LeBron bullies him. This is the predicament elite mismatch attackers who can also pass at a high level, like LeBron, put defenses in today. Put two on the ball, they'll pick you apart with passing, but switch and they can work one-on-one with a matchup they like. Mismatch attacking has become much more common in the NBA in the last decade plus, with the explosion of frequency of ball screens and switching, and I really enjoy this modern chess match. The offense aiming to put their strong point against the defense's weak point while the defense works to find solutions. It's fun, and this was not a prominent part of the game before this period. So, in 2015, The fastest period of offensive evolution in league history is just on the verge of really getting started. Pick and roll volume has already exploded, pace is slowly climbing back up, three-point volume is increasing, and although several aspects of 2000s basketball still remain, the new champions and the Rockets are setting some trends that are about to proliferate through the league at an unprecedented rate. And with those guard-led offenses taking over the league, there was a notable, dramatic shift in the balance of power towards perimeter players and away from bigs. Remember, the power forward position is starting to undergo an identity crisis in 2015, and the center talent just isn't good. Like, the all-NBA centers that year were Marc Gasol, 34-year-old Pau Gasol on the Bulls, and DeAndre Jordan. 2014 to 2016 was by far the weakest mini era for center talent in NBA history. Meanwhile, a wave of elite guard talent was popping up. The true point guards of years past, who were limited as scorers and whose responsibilities were mostly just to get a team into their offense, were trending towards extinction, replaced by a bunch of lead guards who could both score and playmake at a high level. Overall, the league was truly caught between eras. The Grizzlies were still gritting and grinding, leading the league in post-ups with two true bigs because Marc Gasol was not shooting threes yet. Why would he? He's a big guy. While teams like the Clippers, Rockets, and Warriors all engineered elite, super modern offenses that, all in their own ways, offered the best look into what was coming for the NBA. And this transitional period they were caught in was very short-lived. Soon, the entire NBA world would look very different. Now let's journey to the present day, 2025. The NBA Finals have not happened yet, so we're going to take a look at the first meeting between the number one seeds in both conferences, the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Oklahoma City Thunder. So much has changed in the last decade, but I want to start by looking at some standout elements of the defining play type of this era, pick and roll. Interestingly, pick and roll usage league-wide is basically exactly the same as it was a decade ago, and it's actually gone down a bit from its absolute peak a few years ago as defenses have evolved along with offenses in this insane growth period for the entire sport. But teams run a ton of pick and roll these days, and the creativity and diversity within pick and roll has just continued to grow rapidly. And the Cavaliers are among the best pick and roll offenses ever, running the most per game and generating the most points per possession in 2025. From the opening play, Cleveland's doing cool stuff with pick and roll. Dean Wade sets the initial screen, so Darius Garland gets SGA switched onto him, then Jared Allen quickly comes in to screen SGA. Now, instead of the bigger SGA, Cason Wallace is the low man responsible for providing help on Allen's role. But his man Wade is running the baseline to the weak side corner, and Allen, a solid playmaking big, immediately finds him off the short roll. Cason flies out to contest, but Wade at 6'9" just needs a slight window to knock this down. This is an unremarkable play in today's league, but it requires a lot more aggregate skill and basketball IQ than your run-of-the-mill play of years past. For example, we saw Allen make a nice play off the short roll, which, as we just discussed, really only emerged as a valued skill set for a big a decade ago and has become much more common sense. The Cavs actually have two good playmaking bigs to connect their offense, especially through pick and roll, and we saw multiple big-to-big lobs from them just in this game, which is sick. Meanwhile, the Thunder have a big, Isaiah Hartenstein, who can dissect 4-on-3s when the team's superstar, SGA, draws two. He can spot cutters like this as a passing hub and run elbow actions and handoffs, and the ability to facilitate those actions has become increasingly valued and common among bigs, and he also has excellent touch, shooting 57% on floaters on high volume. Remarkably though, Allen has been even better on touch shots, shooting 66% between floaters and hooks combined. So compare this to a decade ago when Andrew Bogut and Timofey Mozgov were starting in the NBA Finals, or 2 decades ago when it was Nazr Muhammad and Ben Wallace, and you see the skill level of these centers, even though neither Allen or Hartenstein is considered a star, and neither one is the coveted stretch 5, is in another stratosphere. These guys can be great release valves for their star guards with their elite touch. They can make decisions as passers. In fact, the three bigs in this game combined for 21 assists. They can be vertical spacers as lob threats, and they can both guard in space, all while they eat up boards and set great screens and protect the rim and do all the old-fashioned big man stuff. So the center position has grown in a cool way, and if you want to see where the evolution of the power forward position has gone, look no further than these two teams. Evan Mobley, at 6'11" and just 23 years old, can push in transition. He can bring the ball up the floor and initiate offense for you. He can run inverted pick and roll to force a switch to a matchup he likes and score in isolation, or attack downhill to then play make for you and find a teammate. And even though he didn't show it in this game, he shoots 37% from deep. And by the way, this is all secondary to the fact that he's a top 5 defender alive, with an insane combination of versatility guarding on the perimeter and elite rim protection. And then what if I told you there's another young power forward on OKC who's just 22 and 7'1", but is extremely agile as a driver, handles very well, can pass, shoots 38% from 3 on good volume, and is every bit as dominant defensively as Mobley? That's Chet Holmgren, who just wasn't healthy for this game. So the power forward position certainly hasn't died. It's just transformed from slower-footed post-up players to mostly either big, versatile wing types like a Jason Tatum, or these sort of 4-5 hybrids who can play both inside and outside on both ends, like Mobley, Chet, or Jaren Jackson Jr. Personally, I think that's sick, and the Cavs and Thunder have the two most potent double big looks in the NBA right now, excelling on both ends in those lineups. But I got sidetracked talking about these bigs. There's still so much more to unpack with a modern pick and roll attack. It's popular now to try to engineer ways to get the ball handler a running start into the pick and roll. This functions almost like a moving handoff, and since Garland is already on the move when he catches it, he can get around this screen with downhill momentum already. Or here, Mobley screens for Garland as he's catching the ball, taking Wallace out of the play to give Garland a head start to go at the matchup he wants. Here, you have a creative use of staggered screens, again starting with a quick handoff to free up Ty Jerome, but Allen, the second screener, actually just slips to the rim, occupying the drop defender, and Jerome beats the drop coverage with his elite floater, a weapon that has become so important in the pick and roll era because those intermediate shots are the ones defenses are willing to concede out of drop. But Jerome and his teammate Garland both shoot about 60% on floaters, so they can cook you with great efficiency without even having to get to the rim, and it's such a pretty shot. Then, of course, we have guards setting ball screens all the time today, which used to be a rarity, but is now a very useful tool to either force a switch the star player wants to hunt, or to free up a shooter, especially if they set a ghost screen, if the defense tries to keep 2 on the ball for even a second. And don't forget the significance of just how high screens can be set today because of the threat elite guards pose as pull-up three-point shooters. This double screen forces 3 defenders to come out well past the three-point line, so Mobley can then slip and dissect a 3-on-2, and it's just absurdly difficult to have to try to defend that much space. Some people lament the heavy use of pick and roll in today's game and act like every pick and roll looks the same, or that running pick and roll automatically means one player is always going to dominate the ball, but it's just not true. This all starts with a double screen that forces a switch, then Garland gets the big to close out on him, quickly passes and cuts, and now he has a 2-on-1, and because he brought the big out of the paint off the switch, there's no rim protector there, and he quickly lays this down to Allen to draw a foul. A ball screen is just the most effective way to embed an advantage into any given play and force the defense to make a choice and give something up. But there are countless different things you can do to set up a ball screen and execute off of it. Similarly, people act like drive and kick basketball is monotonous and doesn't lead to some awesome ball movement. But look at OKC on the very next possession after that pick and roll we just broke down, moving the rock against this zone until Kaysen can attack a closeout to drive and find an open shooter. That's pretty. Here's some more great ball movement from Cleveland to beat OKC's zone. And by the way, zone defense is being utilized much more in the NBA today than ever before. Just a decade ago, it was effectively not used at all. Now certain defenses like Miami and Cleveland and OKC embrace it in doses. Now, offenses are still more efficient against zone on average because if you attack basically any zone defense properly, it's easier to generate open looks from three because any zone inherently has soft spots and teams are just so good at shooting these days. But you can turn to it for a stretch just to give an offense a different look, and teams are going to it more because they're being forced to get more innovative defensively because offenses are simply way better than ever before. Because if you haven't noticed, the baseline skill level required to be a rotation NBA player has risen exponentially in the last decade. Three-point volume has risen by 67% compared to what it was in 2015. Stars are shooting more threes, especially off the dribble, and they're innovating new ways to do so, most notably with the step back. Harden, who we talked about already taking threes at a high volume in 2015, went from taking 56 step back threes that season to 540 just 4 years later. But more significantly, just about every role player is expected to be able to knock down open threes to maximize spacing and keep defenses honest. And I promise, this is a really good thing. Along with that dramatically improved outside shooting, more role players than ever before can legitimately handle and play make, because just being able to knock down an open shot isn't enough. If teams close out hard, you need to be able to drive and find the open man. This is why drive and kick basketball is peaking. You have a bunch of dudes who can shoot and put the ball on the floor and pass everywhere. Of course, three-point volume is way up compared to a decade ago, but teams are also driving far more because spacing is so much better that you're able to attack cleaner paints. That makes for very clean offense. Paints aren't packed with two lumbering bigs anymore, wrecking spacing. Inefficient post-up players aren't wasting possessions for their team with unappealing backdowns. Poor mid-range shooters aren't chucking up ill-advised 18-footers. So much of that bad offense has been cut out. But is the post game dead? Certainly not. Post volume has decreased dramatically league-wide, but the elite post players still post up to their heart's content, and posting up is very valuable for attacking mismatches. It's just that those are the instances in which teams utilize post-ups now, when they have an advantage. It's not just any mediocre big posting up on a whim. Post play now is much smarter, more intentional, and more efficient. Same goes for the mid-range. The league-wide frequency has been more than halved in the last decade, but the mid-range is certainly not dead. If you watch the Thunder play, like we are, you get to watch a top 2 mid-range artist in the game today go to work, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, the smoothest ball handler of his size, 6'6", we've ever seen, with an unparalleled combination of shiftiness, body control, and balance that makes him next to impossible to keep away from the rim. But if he doesn't get to the cup, his bag, depth of counters, ability to stop on a dime to step back, and skill as an intermediate shooter is absurd. And as one of the best isolationists ever, Shai is shooting over 50% from mid-range on 4.5 attempts per game. It's a huge weapon of his. Again, the best guys in the league are still using the mid-range. Like, let's look at Kevin Durant, probably the greatest mid-range shooter ever. Compared to a decade ago, his mid-range volume has only decreased by 15%, but his efficiency has improved dramatically over a huge sample size. In the first half of the 2010s, he shot just over 44% from mid-range. And in the first half of the 2020s, he shot almost 54% from mid-range. Did KD, in a vacuum, get that much better as a mid-range shooter in the heart of his prime? No. The biggest reason for that huge efficiency leap is the significantly improved spacing around KD, making his mid-range shot quality higher, and his mid-range shot selection has improved a bit too. Great players in past generations could be limited by the glaring flaws of their teammates. Today's great players are, by and large, even harder to guard because of the respect commanded by those around them. When people lament the high three-point volume in today's NBA, there's a lot that they're missing. They may have convinced themselves that the 20-foot pull-ups and spot-ups of the past were prettier than the 24-footers they've been traded in for, which they aren't. They've also probably created some idealized version of past offense that ignores its own repetitiveness and the aesthetic problems born out of poor spacing at that time. And they fail to appreciate not only the variety of ways in which today's three-point shots are created, but also the hugely positive effect the constant threat of the three-point shot has on making all offense prettier and better. Bottom line, more skill on the floor makes everybody better and more efficient from everywhere. Also, making offenses even better, pace rapidly increased from 2016 to 2019 and has remained about the same since then at a very similar level to what it was in the late 80s. With ball handling skill at an all-time high and improved spacing, turnovers are also very low in today's NBA and actually reached an all-time low per possession last season. So the end result of this unparalleled offensive skill and IQ is uber efficient offense. The league average offensive rating is 8% higher than it was a decade ago, a jump the likes of which we have not seen since the leap from the early 70s to early 80s. But if anybody tries to tell you this offensive leap is a result of diminished defense, that's just not true. The athletes on the floor defensively have never been better. How about this 7-foot guy with a 7'4" wingspan who's mobile enough to guard the perimeter and recover to block this shot by a guard? And I promise, teams are trying defensively. Look at the Thunder work to entirely deny this first handoff, then the Cavs try to run another handoff to Dean Wade, Jalen Williams gets a hand on it, then he gets out to pressure Wade at nearly half court and uses his 7'2" wingspan to get a hand in there again and jars this ball loose. By the way, there's way more ball pressure today. Just a decade ago, no team pressed more than 3 times per game. Now 2 teams do so more than 10 times per game. Teams are picking up ball handlers further out and are using their quickness to try to disrupt offenses more. Given all the ground they have to cover, speed is at a premium for defenses today. Rim protection is still, and always will be, tremendously important because nothing is more valuable than a shot at the basket, but defenses also have to cover so much ground today. Look at the Cavs just flying around in their zone here, swarming shooters, and then making every pass difficult with their length. And nobody causes more chaos defensively than the Thunder, the fastest and one of the most aggressive defenses we've ever seen, forcing turnovers at a rate we haven't seen in years, all while they also rank as a dominant interior defense. Not just because of their elite rim protection from one big like Chet Holmgren, but also because of their aggregate speed, length, and activity challenging shots at the rim. And both of these teams just have so much versatility. The Cavs have 2 awesome guard creators and 2 awesome bigs. They can play all 4 together and they complement each other beautifully, or they can split the 2 guards and split the 2 bigs, put multiple quality wings alongside them, and put out excellent balanced lineups that ensure they will have 48 minutes of at least 1 great guard and 1 great big being on the floor at all times. Meanwhile, the Thunder have everything at their disposal. They can go double big with Hartenstein and Chet, or go basically 5 out with Chet at center. And we've also seen them go full-on small ball with 6'6" Jalen Williams at center in absence of both bigs and legitimately win games like that. To me, that speaks to an underappreciated greater strength of the league as a whole today. The variety of talents and styles we get to watch. The NBA is brimming with one-of-a-kind talents. A 7'4" giant with an 8-foot wingspan who somehow moves and shoots like a wing. A 7-foot, 280-pound master post scorer who also shoots over 40% from 3 and is a top 2 passer ever. A slithery, magical shot maker at 6'6" who moves like nobody else and is one of the most productive and efficient scorers ever. A 6'11" Greek god with impossible agility and strength for his size, and a gift for passing. A jumbo-sized, all-time great passer and and bully all in one, a pick and roll maestro, the greatest shooter the game has ever seen, the greatest player the game has ever seen, and a 6'11" sharpshooter who is a top 2 scorer ever, all still killing it in their late 30s and in one case at 40. And I could go on and on. Like, I didn't even mention the anomaly. Guard talent in today's league is at an all-time high, and a 6'7" point guard like Penny Hardaway is no longer such a novelty. In fact, many big guards are now among the best players in the league, and offenses are now run not by true point guards, but by those who can lead a unit with both their scoring and playmaking. At the same time as guard talent has peaked, though, this has been an age largely ruled by the evolved big man, with freak 7-footers like Jokic, Giannis, and Embiid combining to win the league's last 6 MVPs. Also, for the 7th straight season, the NBA MVP is going to be a player from outside the United States. The top 4 players in the NBA today, not even including the league's most heralded new talent of the last 20 years, are all foreign-born. The booming worldwide popularity of basketball has created an incredibly rich global talent pool. No longer are the best players coming overwhelmingly from America. Elite players are coming from everywhere. So with the league's talent pool at its peak, increasingly, bigger, better athletes are becoming more skilled at all positions. We've almost become numb to how many alien talents there are in the league today. So talent around the NBA, top to bottom, has never been better. Stars and role players all can simply do more. And when players can do more, teams can do more. Which is why, contrary to popular narratives, all sorts of different styles are thriving around the NBA this season. Just look at how the best teams win. We've already discussed the Cavaliers' avant-garde pick-and-roll attack in 2 skilled bigs, and the Thunder's revolutionary defense, causing havoc and feeding transition offense while they entrust their half-court offense to one of the best and most aesthetically pleasing scorers ever. But then there's the Celtics, with the most aggregate ball handling and shooting skill of any team ever, having mastered the art of mismatch attacking and drive and kick offense. There's the Nuggets, playing through their offensive GOAT in the post with tons of handoffs and cutting around him, but now with an improved ability to play with pace while they have the lowest three-point volume in the league. The Knicks produce great offense with a virtuoso small guard leading the way, lots of cutting and movement around him, and a unicorn offensive center, all while they rank towards the bottom of the league in both pace and three-point volume. The Lakers now have 2 god-tier playmakers and mismatch attackers and play a ton of small ball. The Grizzlies, in the pick-and-roll age, are running less pick-and-roll than any offense we've seen in the last 5 years. At least they were before they fired Taylor Jenkins. But the Rockets are winning with their youth, defense, athleticism, and historic offensive rebounding. The Warriors execute a beautiful motion offense and have been excellent defensively with Jimmy Butler, even as he is their tallest starter at 6'7". The Pacers have a unique blend of elite pace and ball movement. The variety league-wide is just incredible. So, at the end of this journey, having explored and enjoyed all of these different eras of NBA history, I can confidently say that the NBA has evolved to its highest point in terms of talent, scheme, and watchability. That is not to say that the basketball in today's NBA is perfect. Foul baiting is more prevalent than ever before, although that can sometimes still be overstated in my opinion. Like, there was 1 total instance of foul baiting in the entire Cavs Thunder game. That's 1 in over 200 possessions. So people can definitely exaggerate the foul baiting problem, and the good news is free throws are at an all-time low league-wide if you don't like watching them. But foul baiting is a problem in the NBA today, and historically it was very rare for players to specifically hunt fouls. Now, a number of stars are pretty crafty about it, and you can say that's smart for them because getting to the line is super efficient, and they usually are legitimately getting fouled, and all of that is true, but it doesn't change the fact that it's not fun to watch for the viewer. Also, stars are missing more games than ever before, in part because of deliberate load management, but also because players are getting hurt more, likely due to the added strain from covering all the space required in today's game. Also, tanking has been around for a long time in the NBA, but it's become more egregious among the worst offenders over the last 15 years as fewer teams want to exist in NBA purgatory with middling records and middling draft picks. I actually think there were more serious competitive teams this year than we've seen in a long time, but the bottom handful are truly awful, and once you get to March, a lot of weird shit does start to happen as teams kind of have to accept if they're going to miss the playoffs and just start focusing on that draft pick. Again, the league is not perfect. It never has been, and it never will be. But if you stack up the product today against the product from any past era, if you sit down yourself and watch the games from each period, and then you see how the mainstream media, former players, and a lot of fans talk about the game today, it is baffling. The contempt with which they talk about the players, the falsehoods they manufacture about a lack of defense or variety in today's game, the empty appeals to nostalgia, focusing on only the best of the past and the worst of today, the constant, misguided panic about ratings, the endless yapping about anything other than the beauty of the game itself, none of it is grounded in reality, and that is by far the worst aspect of the modern NBA. It's nothing to do with the game itself. The biggest problem is those who capitalize on a culture obsessed with negativity by publicly disparaging and doing a huge disservice to a great sport. But no matter what they say, basketball has grown to a wonderful place, and it is the best it's ever been, but the game has always been amazing in its own unique ways. So just as we should all be fair and honest about the NBA today, we should also respect past generations and find the joy and beauty in the game in all its iterations, because I promise it's there. Instead of diminishing certain eras, we should all strive to understand what makes each era distinct and great. How was the game played at the time? What was most valuable? What were the major innovations of that period? What made the best players so effective? As I always say, you can't expect anyone to be light years ahead of their time when medicine and strategy and skill are constantly evolving and getting better. It's lame to look back at a great player from the past with the intent to disparage them and say, oh, they aren't as good as the guys today, like that's some revelation. That's not how greatness should be measured. You judge people within their time and you appreciate their contributions to the game and understand how they moved it forward. Every era, in one way or another, laid the foundation for the next step forward for the game. That evolution is beautiful, and we should appreciate every phase of it. And I'm sorry if this all sounds corny or overly sincere, and like my whole point is we should all hold hands and be more positive, but I just really love basketball, and the discourse has devolved to such a horrible place that I would really just like for us to all be better. The less we pit generations against each other and just throw shit at the wall to push our nonsense agendas, and the more we actually learn about and cherish the past and present of this game, the better off the whole NBA world will be.